Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, welcome to the show. Well, tonight I'll do my best with my team of experts to pull apart the detail in last night's budget and to help you sift through the spin to work out how you and your family will be impacted. We'll also speak tonight with Opposition Leader Peter Dutton for his reaction to the budget as he also gets ready for his big speech to the Parliament tomorrow night in the budget address in reply. Here's what's coming up on Credlin. Plenty of voter reaction from the budget. I'll show you how the major media players covered it as the government looks open to calling an early election if all the handouts last night help it pick up in the polls. Lots of talk too about Labor's power bill subsidy today, leaving it to one side that it's not means tested. What's most galling is Labor's now giving everyone $300 when power prices under their watch have risen by nearly 40%. 40%. Plus more money in the budget for border protection and to address a rising terror threat, which says to me that Labor knows things are tough ahead, yet on defence, nowhere near the money needed to address the growing China threat. Greg Sheridan will join me too. And a fiery day in question time with confirmation from the budget papers that despite promises from the Prime Minister, Labor will bring in over 1.6 million new migrants over the next 4 years.
The Albanese government has brought in almost 1 million people into our country. Only 265,000 homes have been built. We have people who are living in cars and tents at a record level, and yet nothing in this budget provides support to those people. Why does this government have the wrong priorities, and why is this Prime Minister so weak that he can't provide support to Australians in need?
But first, last night's budget confirms that Anthony Albanese is running the most Green left government we've ever had. More handouts, more debt and more picking winners. So much the Prime Minister's pre-election pledge that he represented safe change. On top of the epic incompetence in migration and border protection, those workplace changes to buy off the unions, the failed attempt to entrench racial difference in our constitution via the voice, and broken promises on tax and superannuation, well, now gone is any pretence of budget responsibility. With terms of trade at a once-in-a-century high and with unemployment at a once-in-half-a-century low, the budget now should be in massive surplus. Instead, there's a wafer-thin $9 billion surplus, largely on the back of fossil fuel exports that the government wants to stop. To be followed then by a long run of deficits between 1% and 2% of GDP, based on baked-in spending, some $315 billion on the so-called care economy. Plus, there's $80 billion in off-budget spending, student loans, low-income housing, more green projects, and another $7 billion on that boondoggle, the snowy hydro 2.0. But even with so much spending off budget, net debt, well, it's still expected to grow by another $200 billion over the next 5 years. All the old budget rules, such as keeping tax under a certain percentage of GDP, capping growth in spending, and insisting that any new spending is offset by savings that helped Peter Costello deliver 10 straight budget surpluses. Paul Keating too. He got there with those rules to force surpluses. Well, they've now been scrapped in favour of the creative accounting that Labor dresses up spending as investment.
Investing in a future made in Australia and expanding business investment. We're also investing $6.2 billion in new investments. We're investing in vital projects, investment in our economy, focusing investment to lift private investment. We will create a front door for investors that adds discipline to investments in the national interest and streamline approvals across environmental, planning, cultural heritage and foreign investment.
It's spending, not investment. That's just treasurer's spin. What this budget conclusively proves is that Labor has monumentally failed to grasp that a government can't spend a dollar that it doesn't get from taxpayers, either as taxes now or taxes tomorrow, to pay for today's debt. As always, Labor thinks that government's much smarter at spending your money better than you are. All the average Australian will gain from this budget that's new is the non-means tested $300 electricity handout that won't nearly compensate anyone for the spike in power costs. And for low-income renters, some extra help that won't nearly compensate them for the extra migration and the interest rate-driven rise in housing costs. Even then too, these are essentially the government putting money in one pocket that it's taken out of your other pocket. The only real surprise in the budget was the brazenness with which the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, abandoned any fidelity to the fiscally responsible pro-market legacy of Keating and Bob Hawke to trumpet the virtues of green interventionism. The relentless boosterism of Chalmers sits uneasily with the fact that Australians are struggling with their mortgage repayments that have doubled, and they don't feel the government has helped them in any way. As recent polls show, voters have well and truly noticed that GDP per person, well, that's fallen for 4 straight quarters, meaning that whatever the headline numbers might say, ordinary families, well, they're in a deep recession. Now, even if these handouts temporarily mask some of the policy-driven cost increases, well, struggling families are much more likely to spend on necessities than keep the money in their pocket. Hence the overall inflationary pressures that so worry the Reserve Bank and have led to the sustained rise in interest rates that might even increase again. The budget has only intensified the paradox of the Reserve Bank tapping the economic brakes while the government's pushing the accelerator. So much so that economists are now tipping more interest rate rises. It seems undeniable that the biggest impact of this budget will be keep rates higher for longer, with even the budget papers now forecasting there's no drop in the cash rate before the middle of next year. Now, don't forget, we were promised a rate cut by the middle of this year. Then it was pushed out to Christmas. And now Jim Chalmers says in his own budget papers, you will not get relief, if you get it at all, before well into next year.
2.75% inflation by Christmas, a Stephen Kennedy prediction or a Jim Chalmers prediction?
We don't sit in our office and write the forecasts. The Treasury team of very professional, very diligent people do that work.
As well, there's permanently higher wages for aged care workers and childcare workers. As I've said, fine. If they deserve an increase, they do, sure. But why are you as a taxpayer paying the wages of people in the private sector? There's been no serious attempt in this budget to rein in skyrocketing NDIS costs either. All they've done is stop the cost shifting from the states to the Commonwealth. It's still the one taxpayer footing the bill. And it's far from clear that the government's serious about big cuts to migration. Quite apart from the fact it needs continued high immigration to pump up the overall economic growth numbers and to avoid a technical recession, and even on its own figures, it still expects to keep immigration at double the average of the Howard years, there's still as yet no specificity about how it'll cap overseas student numbers or require those educational institutions to house the students they import. But this has become a characteristic of the Albanese government, to declare an objective without any detail about its implementation and then to act as though wishing it makes it happen. Now, given the woke obsessions of our universities, is the government's announced objective to graduate 8 out of 10 Australians by 2050, so 8 out of 10 of us have got to have a university degree, says Labor. Is that about making us more productive as opposed to creating more green left voters? Then there's some $23 billion in various Future Made in Australia programs, all designed to make us a renewable energy superpower because the Treasurer insists the world's committed to net zero. Well, they're not. China and India are not, or at least not as quickly or as convulsively as here in Australia. It doesn't matter how often the government asserts it. The notion that Australia has a comparative advantage here, as if other countries don't have wind or sunlight, well, it hardly stands up to scrutiny. There may be a case for some assistance to the strategic minerals area that we need for battery making, especially given China's attempt to corner this market. But it's hard to credit that we should invest in green hydrogen that's completely unproven at scale, or that we can somehow out-subsidise the US or the EU. Now, given that many of the big players in this area of billionaires such as Twiggy Forrest, why is the government relieving them of the need to commit more of their own money? Why is Labor bankrolling billionaires but making ordinary families scrimp and save? It's now a decade since the last budget that attempted serious economic reform, when the coalition tried to roll back entitlements and rein in some of this government spending. But with no obvious cuts to anything last night and an abundance of giveaways, this budget has all the feel of a pre-election budget, something the Treasurer today refused to rule out.
Is it an interest rate cut? Is it an election victory? Because those budget papers have election written all over them.
A lot of you have asked me, is this the last budget of the parliamentary term? My answer to that is I'm expecting to do another one, but that's in the hands of Prime Ministers.
Weasel words. Perhaps backed with more wall-to-wall government advertising, these budget handouts might be enough to anaesthetise voters. But if the government does run to a premature election before the end of next year or before it does another full budget, it will expose its fear that the overall economy is just going to get worse. As I said, very busy time in Canberra. We'll go there now for the headlines. Sky News political reporter Cam Redden.
Every household in the country will have their energy bills slashed by $300 as the coalition agrees to back Labor's budget relief.
Support for Australians. All Australians.
We'll support the bill that the government's putting through. I don't understand why you and I on high incomes would be getting $300.
Rebates will not be means tested, so everyone gets it regardless of their income.
The Prime Minister is giving billions of dollars to billionaires.
Spare us the faux outrage.
The Treasurer is adamant his plan will bring inflation below 3% by Christmas.
Our Treasury forecasts for inflation factor in what we're doing with the cost of living package.
You have to make sure that as you rearrange the pain, you don't add to the inflation. And the government did the first, it didn't really do the second.
Looking beyond the inflation fight, Jim Chalmers is turning his mind to investment. The much-hyped Future Made in Australia plan will invest over $22 billion in a range of emerging industries.
Mobilising Australian industry, Australian manufacturing to make the things that'll help us to get to net zero.
I'm not sure that it's going to be enough to really drive that sort of new investment.
Highlighted by cost of living measures, business incentives and optimistic forecasts, Labor's third budget has raised expectations of an early election.
That's in the hands of Prime Ministers.
On the election, it's due in 2025.
But it could be held as early as August, avoiding the need for another budget next year, which would likely deliver a deficit.
I think they're setting themselves up for an election this year. I think they're worried about the economy deteriorating.
I'm expecting to do another one.
Cameron Redden, Sky News, Canberra.
All right, I'm going to get into all the politics of last night's budget in a moment. Plenty of financial detail. I want to make sure that you are across. And to help me do that, let's bring in our budget guru, Sky News business editor, Ross Greenwood. Well, Ross, this is a bit like a grand final for you, budget week. I want to get your top line summary, if I can. What are your big takeaways from the budget?
I guess the reality is it's what it does to inflation and therefore the pressure that the government is putting onto the Reserve Bank by saying that basically it can continue to spend at a significant rate, but at the same time also allege that it's going to reduce inflation during that time. Now, the real worry of that is that the inflation reduction could come around as a result of a significant fall in Australia's economy and at the same time a rise in the unemployment rate. And that's not good for families, not good for the government, it's not good for the nation. So you really hope that's not the case. But if you go even to the $300 sort of handouts to every household for energy relief, well, in that particular case, the reason why that is said to be not inflationary is because if you do take it out, it's part of the CPI, same as rental assistance as well. And so what you're starting to see is a real divergence between where the Reserve Bank thinks inflation, economic growth, employment is going to go to in the future. And you can see it here. But one thing to recognise is that the Reserve Bank has effectively come out with its own forecasts just a week ago. So it's not as though these are, history somewhere in the distant past. These are very fresh forecasts from the Reserve Bank, and this is at odds in many ways with where the government and Treasury think our economy is going to.
Do you think because the government have just appointed the new governor that they think that perhaps she's not as independent as previous governors, that they can sort of from the bully pulpit of politics talk her into keeping rates where they are now and not perhaps increasing them? Because I think that's the tussle that's going on at the moment. We've seen the Treasurer in the last 4 or 5 days really talk down the ability of the RBA to get these inflation forecasts right. He's talking up Treasury, getting them right. And the tussle, I called it just then in the editorial, it's like the government's got its foot on the accelerator, the RBA's got its foot on the brake, and we know that's a car crash.
I've got to tell you, that's the reality. But then go back to the basics of this. You cannot spend this much money, plus having tax cuts coming, which are worth close on $25 billion, without having people spend the money. It's pretty basic. If you get the money and all of a sudden there's a cost of living crisis, you are going to consume that money. You need to. And so this is what families around Australia will do. This is what businesses around Australia will do. And so as a result, guess what? The temptation will be there for business to raise prices or to hold prices, not to cut prices, knowing that this money is coming towards them. What does that do for inflation? It doesn't bring it down. It's got to leave it exactly where it is or maybe have it to rise. And as I say, the real drama of this is if you do believe that inflation is going to come down, it will probably come at the cost of economic growth. And therefore, as a result, unemployment starts to rise. And heaven help me if I think that a Labor government were actually encouraging employers, large and small, to shed workers. That should be the basic mantra of a Labor government. But that is also potentially an Achilles heel for this government if that is starting to unwind and unemployment starting to rise as you get out towards an election later this year or into next year.
And if it gets tough paying your mortgage now, given how much rates have gone up, it's impossible if you lose your job. One of the things that I think is really interesting in the budget, this is a budget where government spending as a share of the economy is forecast to rise to its highest levels outside the pandemic in 40 years. So the deficits ahead of us, they are all structural. Now, explain what that means for taxpayers.
So let's say, for example, if I'm going to give you a good example of this is the $300. The $300 effectively comes and goes. But then if you go out and you say give wage rises to certain parts of the economy, if you give tax cuts to the economy, that's baked in. That's not easily able to be clawed back by government. Now, it can be, but it will come at a political cost. And so what you can see here with the outlooks from where they were in 2023, then looking out into those out years, you can see how significant those budget deficits are. So they mount. So what that means is if we go to some of the fastest growing pieces of expenditure in the government's sort of book right now, we're talking about interest costs rising basically 10%. We're talking about the NDIS rising more than 9%. So there are big areas of this budget that simply are very hard for the government to be able to control. And so really that means they've got to find more taxes, which is a reason, as you point out, that not only is this government a big spending government, but it's also a very big taxing government as well, largely as a result of bracket creep, where inflation has pushed people into higher tax brackets. And so when they say we're giving you these tax cuts back, remember, this is your money. It's not actually the government's money, it's your money they're virtually returning to you, courtesy of what has been the high inflation and the tax system pushing you into higher tax rates as well.
This Future Made in Australia scheme, they like to paint it as a manufacturing scheme. It's not really. It's predominantly fixated on green projects. And when you look at the detail, when you look at who is getting up in these grants, it's a cash cow for billionaires. If they want to back green energy, people like Twiggy Forrest, Malcolm Turnbull and others, what's wrong with using their own money?
Well, there's nothing wrong with that at all. And in fact, the reality is that this is almost a carrot and stick approach that the government's got, because this money that they've put, $22.7 billion over 10 years, I press the Treasurer on this. Is it on balance sheet, off balance sheet? What he concedes is effectively it's production credits that those in critical minerals and green hydrogen are going to receive. So they don't actually receive the credits until they produce the product. So it's almost an incentive built into business plans to allow them the confidence to go ahead and really create the plants. But then again, remember, it's not actually cash that the government is outlaying. It's actually money that they would forego if and when these ever got off the ground. So the truth is, if these plants never get off the ground, then the likelihood is the government won't ever spend the money. But the government has got to be seen to be doing something here, because the message they're hearing loud and clear from business right now, and it doesn't matter whether you're Orica making explosives and ammonia and fertiliser, or whether it's BHP or whether it's Brickworks or whether it's other big companies, they're saying we have a choice right now, and we can invest in America where they will give us genuine subsidies, where the gas prices are basically a quarter to a third of the price of Australia, and wages there are also under control. So their returns are greater in America than in Australia right now. And part of the structural problem the government has not really addressed at all is that we have become less competitive and therefore less profitable as a nation to do business in. And that is a fundamental problem that government has got to address.
Terrific, Ross. As I said, you're the guru. Thank you for all of that. We're right across what we need to know. We'll get into the politics now with Andrew Clennell. Thank you, Ross Greenwood. He joins me now, Sky News political editor Andrew Clennell. You're obviously in Canberra, Andrew. We'll get to the punters out there, the voters in a moment. But how's this gone down around the halls of Parliament House? Has Labor got a spring in its step?
There's absolutely no doubt about that. They do have a spring in their step. They feel like they're up mojo-wise. It's a bit like when they did the stage 3 tax cuts rejig, and that was well received. I guess that glow only lasted for 3 or 4 weeks, although it also got them through Dunkley. So that definitely is the case. From the opposition's point of view, that there are many there who are now convinced there'll be an election this year.
Yeah, I'll get to that in a moment. I want to look at how it was sold, the budget out there in newspaper land. You're an old newspaper man, so I thought this is worth putting up on the screen for people. The Australian, well, they ran a caricature of Jim Chalmers this morning. They had the headline, "Bung it on Afterpay." That's, of course, referring to all the spending being added to our $900 billion debt. The Sydney Morning Herald, it was critical of the $300 energy rebate, saying that Labor can't subsidise its way to lower inflation without impacting interest rates. Ross Greenwood made that point just now. The Herald Sun, well, they ran charmed and dangerous, putting the handouts in one column and the fact that the government's glossing over the debt burden in another. Tough or fair, do you think, Andrew, this morning, the Prince?
I think a lot of it's pretty fair, because there is a fair bit of political trickery in this budget. We both know that, Peter, but maybe it'll work. I mean, they think they've played a political blinder. I don't think there's any Australians who are going to be unhappy they get $300 off their energy bill. There's cynicism whether that actually cuts inflation. These guys are saying it does. Really? Anyway, and they've got tax cuts coming at the same time, and they're delivering a surplus. In a way, you don't get a better economic story for Jim Chalmers. You certainly wouldn't get a better story if you went to a budget again in March before an election in May, which is why I'm in the camp that it's highly likely, or at least likely, that they will go to an election this year.
Well, the Prime Minister doesn't pay his power bill, as we know. Taxpayers paid at the Lodge in Kirribilli. I think it's a long time he's paid one if he thinks $300 goes anywhere near covering the increases. Just on the election issue, because you and I both picked up the fact that, you know, we were promised an interest rate cut about now. Then it was pushed out to Christmas. Now the budget papers say there is no rate cut forecast at all until the middle of next year. You pinged the Treasurer on this today. We've played that grab a little earlier on. So you say there's a lot of flexibility in this budget for them to go early. You look at the handouts, I think that's probably right. We've got a state poll in October. We've got a WA election in March. The next budget's due in March. I reckon they'll call it at the end of this year or next year, and they can do it around the time of WA and still avoid another budget. What do you think?
I reckon more likely December 7, November 30. I don't think you want to get calling it at the same time as WA. That would be a bit of an affront to WA. There's actually provision, I think, to get the WA election moved, but WA is such a key swing seat for state, should I say, for them. They won't want to be annoying WA. So there's only a couple of windows.
But you can call it after WA.
Queensland.
You can call it after WA.
Yeah, that's
you can call it
right.
after WA and still miss the budget.
Yeah, but then you promised a budget in March. So WA is about March, whatever it is. If you don't have a budget there, people are going to say, where the hell's your budget? So, no, I don't think that works either. They'd have to produce a budget then and go in April or May. So, look, I just think it's geared towards it. I'm not saying Albanese's made up his mind, but, gee, he changed his language this morning, and it just looks obvious, Peter, to be frank. I mean, look at the alternative. I mean, there's a risk with any scenario, right? You could call an election and then the Reserve Bank could hike rates, for example. But as things stand, if they wait for May, there's every chance from what we see in these numbers and what we see in the economy and what we hear from Michelle Bullock, there's no rate cut before May. Now, how are people going to be by May? Yep. They're going to be happy. They're going to be prepared to give you a chance more in November. So, look, it ratchets up from here. Peter Dutton's got this budget reply, and I understand a big housing policy coming tomorrow night. And so, you know, that'll be keenly watched. It's always in that last year, or perhaps less in this case, of that 3-year cycle that everything ratchets up. And I very much have that feeling this week. We're in election mode already almost.
Just quickly, I want to point out migration too. They said they'd bring it down. They've got these soft caps, they call them, on international students. But if you look at the numbers last night, you can see they've already had to uplift or revise their forecast upwards for migration numbers this financial year. In my EFO in December, they said net overseas migration would come in at 375,000, 100,000 there. It's now expected that number's going to be close to 400,000. They say it'll then fall to 260,000 and then it'll fall again to 255,000. Well, none of these numbers they've landed at all. And even when you get out to 235,000 in the out years, I mean, that's the biggest numbers we'd ever seen before this government in Australia's history. They occurred under Big Australia Kevin Rudd. I mean, this is a shocker. And overall, I think the numbers are 1.6 million people coming over the next 4 years.
Well, how could you have any confidence that they reach the 260 when the last 2 years they've had 518 and 395 and they predicted 375? That's your point. And the other interesting aspect to that is the Treasurer himself has admitted that one of the reasons he's able to come up with this optimistic inflation forecast is because they're putting the brakes supposedly on migration. Well, I think it takes a while for the wheels to go in motion, for those brakes to be on. So it's just such a rubbery forecast, I've got to say. I'd probably, take a bit more stock of the Reserve Bank's forecast, which is bad news for any of us with mortgages.
Good tip there on Peter Dutton. I've got him coming up. I'll see what he can tell us. Thank you, Andrew Clennell. Right after the break, as I said, Peter Dutton, he'll join me both for his assessment on the budget, what the coalition's likely to support or not, and where he is expected to go tomorrow night in his big budget address in reply. Plus, Labor's pumping more money into border security and into terrorism. That tells me things are pretty serious, and it shows me how asleep at the wheel the government's been. Welcome back. Still to come, I'll get into the details of what's in the budget for national security, given the serious threats we face, including speculation that the mothballed Christmas Island detention centre is about to be reopened. But first, one thing that was abundantly clear from last night's budget is that Jim Chalmers has one eye squarely on the next federal election, even if he wants to pretend he hasn't.
The Prime Minister didn't really rule out the chance of an early election off this budget this morning. He sort of danced around it a bit. Will you rule out an early election?
I'm assuming that we go full term and I'll be ready to go for a fourth budget and it'll be another responsible budget. I'll be ready and raring to go to hand down the budget whenever my Prime Minister tells me to.
Not that anyone believes Labor anyway after their broken tax cuts promise. Joining me now, the opposition leader, Peter Dutton. Well, Peter Dutton, thank you for your time. I know it's a busy week for you. This looks very much like a pre-election budget. It looks like Labor's trying to buy off voters with handouts. Do you think an early election's on the cards? And if they go early, doesn't this just expose their fear that the economy is going to get worse, not better?
Well, Peter, it's great to be on the show, and I think you're spot on. I think they are very worried about a deterioration in the economic circumstances. They've had now 2 budgets and a third one last night to get the economic settings right. Instead, all they've done is make decisions that's made it harder for Australians, not easier. They've driven up inflation, and therefore interest rates have stayed higher for longer. And I think a lot of Australians understand that there are 2 surpluses that the government's now delivered, but really that's what they were bequeathed by the coalition when we were in government through good economic management. They get surpluses in the first 2 years, and then when Labor really starts to take over after having made the decisions, we go into deficits for as far as you can see. So the debt that's accumulated will be phenomenal, and I think they do want to go to an election before Australians realise just how bad they have mucked up the economy and how hard they've made it for small business and families across the country.
Look, a lot of criticism today about that one-off $300 payment on energy bills. A lot of the focus is on the fact, of course, it's not means tested. But I think what's been lost in the commentary is the fact that the last election they promised everyone a $275 cut, an ongoing cut to our power bills, not a one-off payment. And because it's a handout, well, it's coming out of our pocket anyway as taxpayers, and it goes nowhere near close to offsetting how much they've driven power prices up anyway.
No, exactly. The Prime Minister promised before the last election on 97 occasions that he'd reduce people's power prices by $275 per year. So it wasn't just $275 over the term. And what we know is that for the average household now, the cumulative effect of Labor's energy price increases, electricity price increases, mean that people have paid about $1,000 more. So there's no way in the world that they can be compensated in the way that the Prime Minister committed to, that he promised, that he said his word, meant something. That's what people thought before the election. Of course, when he says that now, people just don't believe it anymore. And I think a lot of Australians are really getting to know what it means for a renewables-only policy. Power prices are going to continue to go through the roof under this government.
Ross Greenwood, Peter Dutton was at the top of the show. I mean, he says there's economic 101. If you put all of this money out there into the economy, people will spend. And if people spend, that's inflationary. The Treasurer says, no, that's absolutely wrong. But when you consider federal spending is going to hit 27% of GDP in the next financial year, how is that not inflationary? And there's this concession anyway in the budget papers that there will be no rate cut now. It was forecast for this year, but the government's own papers say we will not see a cut in interest rates until next year at the earliest.
Well, Peter, I think you find 2 things in this budget. One is that they're trying to buy votes through the cash splash, which is inflationary, as you point out. And I think they're trying to buy themselves a rate cut this year before things start to really deteriorate under this government next year. In that circumstance, we know that the Reserve Bank and all of the credible economists who have made comment overnight panning this budget, I'd frankly take their word over the word of Jim Chalmers and Anthony Albanese, because it is inflationary, and it is always the case under a Labor government that they tax and spend, and that results in higher interest rates. And interest rates will always be higher under a Labor government. History's demonstrated that, and unfortunately, the lessons of history haven't been learnt by this government.
For all that talk about dropping migration too, I mean, if you look at the budget detail, they've had to revise up the current year's forecast, but we're still going to have 1.6 million new migrants arriving here at the same time as we're in the middle of a housing crisis. I mean, that's the reality in the budget. What's the government say to that?
Well, they keep saying that they're going to reduce the number of migrants coming into the country, but the trouble is when you get the actual figures, they always increase. So you're right, 1.67 million people over 5 years. That's bigger than the population of Adelaide. And we know that over the last couple of years, it's about 900,000 people who have come in through the migration program. and we've only built about 265,000 homes as a country. So if you ask yourself, why is there a housing crisis, why is there a rental crisis in this country? It's because of the decisions of the Albanese government. No Labor government, no Liberal government in our history has had those sorts of numbers. And it's not just housing, Peter. I mean, people know when you move into a new area, you try and enrol your kids in the local kindergarten or enrol your kids in the local school, try and go to a new GP, turn up for elective surgery or to an emergency department. Everything is just chock-a-block. You jump in your car and drive to work or run the kids to school in the morning. The roads are gridlocked, and it's because there hasn't been proper planning, and it's because this government really has brought in people at a record number. We're a great country because of migration, but it needs to be properly managed, and the government hasn't done that.
Now, I'm not stupid enough to think, having been in an opposition leader's office, that you're going to announce policy changes or detail tonight ahead of your big speech tomorrow night. But Andrew Clennell says there's a rumour that you might have a housing announcement in the mix tomorrow night. Can you at least confirm that?
Well, I think housing is one of the biggest issues facing our country at the moment. I think the energy crisis that Labor's creating, the housing crisis that Labor's created, and the security crisis that Labor's created, I think they are three priorities for our country, and you can expect that I'll have a lot to say on those issues. I think people feel less safe in our country. There are 3 boat arrivals last week, so our borders aren't as secure as they used to be. We see that the government's released 152 criminals from immigration detention. Some of them have committed egregious attacks and crimes against Australians already. We know that this government's delivered 12 interest rate rises. Inflation here is a bigger problem than what it is in most other comparable nations. And we know that in terms of the Australian-made policy that the government's got, the only thing that you get Australian-made under a Labor government is inflation. And Australian families at the moment are $35,000 worse off under Mr Albanese. And I think the housing crisis that they've created means that we've got people living in tents and in cars at the moment. Homelessness is at a record level because of the government's migration program. And I just don't think it's fair. And at the same time, they're handing out billions of dollars to businesses that frankly should be able to thrive in an environment where there is massive demand for critical minerals the world over.
We'll leave it there, Peter Dutton. Good luck for tomorrow night. We'll be watching it here on Sky News at 7:30, of course. We'll see you then. All right, let's go to that issue, national security and defence. We'll bring in Greg Sheridan, foreign editor at The Australian. Greg, $50 billion they trumpeted in defence spending. Sounds big, sounds exactly what we need. But you look at the budget papers last night, only 5.7 of that is in the 4-year forward estimates, which I think is pretty appalling. What's your takeout in a national security sense in the budget?
Well, Peter, great to be with you. You've had a terrific program tonight, full of information about the budget. Look, I think this is in many ways the most scandalous failure of this government of all. Richard Marles ought to be prosecuted under truth in advertising legislation. So, 2 simple facts about the defence budget. First of all, Marcus Hellier from Strategic Analysis Australia, the preeminent defence budget analyst in Australia, says defence has lost about 8% of its purchase power because of inflation. It doesn't get compensated for inflation. It does get compensated for currency movements. So under the Albanese government, we've had a real cut in defence spending. Now, the $5.7 billion, which Richard Marles says is going to come over the forward estimates, it turns out that even of that amount, almost all of it comes in the last year of the forward estimates. So it's not until the 4th year that $3.8 billion of that, frankly, quite trivial amount of money comes. Now, assuming Andrew Clennell is right and we get an election this year, that means that will be in the first budget of the 3rd term of the Albanese government before you even get a notional increase of that $3.8 billion. So all of these sky-high figures Richard Marles talks about, it's like a bad episode of Utopia. He's talking about spending in 10 years' time and in 20 years' time and so on. small thing, the forecast that said he was going to go up to 2.4% of GNP in 10 years' time or something. It's come back to 2.3%. But none of that is real. It's all baloney. I am a bit mystified why the opposition doesn't eviscerate him more. I think it's because, frankly speaking, they had such a shocking record themselves in government, and they're going to have to make a real commitment about dollars themselves. But quite soon, NDIS will be a bigger expenditure item than defence. We're starting to spend billions of dollars on nuclear subs. We're going to cripple all the other programs, and the nuclear subs are at least 10 years away and probably more. And the final thing is, we're 4,500 short of our numbers now. Next year, we're going to be 5,000 short of our troop numbers. So this is a debacle in defence, and I'm surprised that, as I say, that the government doesn't pay more of a penalty for it.
I did think of you last night, Greg, as I was listening to the government sort of squirm a little bit when people said, well, why couldn't you have targeted that $300 energy payment? Why are millionaires getting it? Why does it go to everybody? And they said, oh, look, it's the systems can't work. It's too complex to have worked out who's rich and who's poor to target it. I mean, this is the same government who says we can build nuclear submarines in Australia, and they can't work out who's rich and who's poor to hand out $300. But in there last night too, I picked up there was $600 million for border security, $76 million for ASIO. Now, this says to me they've got a problem on their borders. They're now admitting it, at least in fiscal terms. But ASIO, this is the same ASIO that they won't let come in and sit at the National Security Committee of Cabinet. That's also telling.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Peter. So one other final footnote about the gross defence spend. As you rightly say, the government is just spewing money out at the moment. It's like it's got fire hydrants going full pump, just spewing dollars out at enormous amounts. You know, between state and federal government, there's going to be $20 billion new money in the economy next year, and they won't increase defence spending by any meaningful amount at this moment. Now, in 5 or 6 years' time, we're going to be in a world of pain with debt and terms of trade not as good and everything, and yet they pretend that they're going to suddenly make heroic, massive increases in defence spending then. The increase to border security and ASIO is obviously something the government doesn't want to do because they honestly, like Joe Biden, they just don't believe national security is their issue. They're not going to get any votes out of it. The money doesn't go to their mates. And these are immediate increases in spending which they are being forced to make. You can see the beginning of the boats again. You can see the increase in the terror threat within Australia. Now they have humiliated ASIO and ACIS by kicking them off the National Security Committee, but that's who they're going to turn to protect Australians from the terror threat. So I think these expenditure increases, they're welcome, but they're through gritted teeth and they're dictated by dire necessity, I would say, over the next 12 months.
Spot on, Greg Sheridan. Thank you. I'll read all your analysis in The Australian on the entrails as we're all working our way through the budget.
Peter.
Thank you, Greg. All right, we'll get back to those rumours on national security after the break that the mothballed Christmas Island Detention Centre is about to be back in business, meaning the people smugglers are too. And this worry about the demolition of an Anzac monument in order to make way for a wind farm. A little later, Kel Richards, of course, but let's get into things with my panel. Shadow Environment Minister, Senator Jonathan Duddiam, and Senior Fellow at the Menzies Research Centre, the Australian's Nick Cater. Well, I want to start, if I can, with some exclusive footage of a pro-Palestinian encampment at the University of Melbourne. They've been asked to shut down and go, but look what happened when the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Pip Nicholson, asked them to peacefully move on.
Can I have your attention, please? My name is Pip Nicholson. And you're complicit in genocide! Shame! Shame! I'm asking you in peace to respect the peers across the university, some of whom are deeply traumatised by the ongoing escalation. I come in peace.
Jono, that's from today. Pretty shocking.
Peter, it is. I mean, they're supposed to be at university for education, not indoctrination. And to see that sort of behaviour, this loving, peaceful, tolerant approach they're taking to this, I think is just appalling. And good on the Vice-Chancellor for stepping in to try and bring some sense here. What was more alarming today, though, Peter, was the pre-organised approach taken by a senator, a Labor senator who gave a speech to a group of assembled journalists to call out her Prime Minister to stand up for Palestine, calling out Israel as perpetrators of genocide and that we must stand up to this evil. The fact that we now have a parliamentarian willing to stand up in a pre-organised speech to say these sorts of things means that there is something very wrong in our country, and the Prime Minister actually now needs to show some spine and address this head on and not try and have a bet each way. It's too late now and he's got to fix this.
You're not wrong. Hey, Nick, I mentioned before Christmas Island. The talk is that they're taking it out of mothballs. A whole lot of interpreters have turned up. They've been there for 5 days. Residents are spotting border force activity around the old centre. This tells me they are now admitting the people smugglers are back in game.
This is chilling, Peter. I mean, I just hope that place would never be open again because, you know, it just carries those terrible memories of that boat being dashed ashore at the rocks and people dying before our eyes. We don't want to see this. And the fact that Labor has let our borders get out of control to a point where they're having to reopen Christmas Island really tells you something. As you know, it's a very expensive facility to run. It's not the ideal way to run a border policy, but that's what you're driven to do if things get out of control. So I think the fact that they're opening it is a clear sign that things are out of their control and they just don't know what to do about it.
Jono, it might sound like a little issue, but it's really important. Locals in Oberon are up in arms that an Anzac monument, which is an avenue of trees that was planted, they're 100 years old now, in honour of fallen diggers, will be bulldozed in order to put in a wind farm.
No, this is not a little issue at all. Where do we stop? Where do we draw the line with what expense is appropriate to foot when it comes to this pursuit of transition to renewables? In Victoria, we saw Jacinda Allen saying that we will destroy a Ramsar-listed wetland, trash the environment to save the planet to build this terminal for an offshore wind farm. And now in Oberon, it's okay to desecrate a monument to our fallen diggers, people who sacrificed their lives for our freedom and liberties for a wind farm. Like, honestly, the world has gone crazy. If we're going to allow that to happen, there is, again, something very wrong that needs to be addressed. And the Premier should actually take some action here.
That boondoggle from Malcolm Turnbull, if I can, Nick, Snowy 2.0, promised, we were told, it would cost $2 billion. Another $7 billion in the budget last night. I think the total is something like $12 billion. You're in Finland. They've just opened up their latest nuclear reactor last year. That's obviously the way to go.
Yeah, I was at the Olkiluoto 3 reactor on Monday talking to the people from TVO, which is a Finnish-led consortium that run it. It's entirely private sector. It's entirely 100% Finnish-owned. And I said to them, well, how much did this baby cost? You know, it came online last year. It was late. It took longer to build. 5.6 billion euro. That's 9.6 billion Australian dollars at the current rate, i.e. considerably cheaper than Snowy Hydro. And for that, you get a state-of-the-art, third-generation pressurised water reactor, best in Europe. And it's producing 1.6 gigawatt of power, which is, like a fair-sized coal-fired power station 24 hours a day. So we are obviously going for second best. And Chris Bowen's continual claim that renewables are cheaper just doesn't stack up as soon as you get to a country like Finland, where they're actually doing the sensible thing and pushing ahead with nuclear.
Geez, we're lucky to have you on the ground there at the moment, Nick. Thank you as always. Gents, see you both next week. Hey, just before we go to a break, there's been this furore today about what Jim Chalmers' wife Laura was wearing last night. It was a Carla Zampatti outfit, I'm told, a $2,000 odd jacket and a top, or jacket and a dress. Now, I have to say, this is just over the top. The woman has a job. I mean, she's privately employed. What she chooses to spend her money on. That's old-fashioned to think the bloke's buying everything just because we pay his wage. We've got a say in what his wife spends her money on. I don't know, Laura. I don't think I've ever even met her, but I think that's a bit rich. All right, we'll leave it there. Coming back after the break, Kel Richards with words. I'm conscious of the clock. Let's bring him straight in. Kel Richards joining me as he does every Wednesday. A bit of a budget flavour with the first one. Kel, Kathy wants to know, why do we always say the Treasurer brings down the budget?
Well, it's a compound verb. To bring something down is to bring it from a higher level down to a lower level. I mean, I suppose that might be from the executive arm of government down to the legislative arm of the government. But I suspect, this is me guessing, it's much older. It goes back to the days when parliaments were just advisors to the king. And so Henry VIII would send the Chancellor of his Exchequer to bring down the budget to his advisors in the parliament. I suspect it's that old.
I feel like this a bit tonight on the show. We've been very, very busy. Raymond wants to know the meaning of under the pump.
Yes, and the Treasurer keeps talking about people being under the pump. There are four it means obviously being under high pressure and at risk and working hard and, worrying. There are four suggestions. Eric Partridge thinks it comes from an old sort of a punishment where people were dunked under the village pump. Another one says it's just the fact that pumps have pressure. Another one says it goes back to construction sites where they pump concrete and you've got to work fast. But I think the correct one goes back to the days of sailing ships. When they started to take water, it was all hands to the pump, working hard, at risk. I think that's where it comes from.
Well, you're always like that. I'm sometimes like that. We've certainly been like that tonight. Kel Richards, thank you as always. See you next week. That's it for me tomorrow. More budget analysis. Peter Dutton, of course, tomorrow night. Up next, the Bolt Report.